Hey, everybody, this is Life is a Gamble, episode number 4, Blair Hull. Before I get to that, just a couple of announcements. I want to remind people that if you are hearing this on the old Gambling with an Edge stream, please change over to the Life is a Gamble stream because eventually it will not be going out in both places. So this applies to people who are using a podcast app like iTunes or Spotify. So yeah, just switch it on over, and that way you won't miss anything when the new episodes come out. Okay, now here's the show. Okay, so I'd like to, first of all, let me start here. Welcome, Blair Hull, to Life is a Gamble.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I want to start in 1987, and the markets are crashing, and you are on the Chicago Board of Options Exchange at that time, or were you in the Pacific?
We had a market maker operation that was operating in Chicago on the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, but we also had traders in New York at the American Stock Exchange also. And we had a presence on the New York Stock Exchange. So we dealing with multiple markets here.
I see. And so could you just paint a picture for our audience of what this crash was like and what happened?
Well, nobody expected this. The markets had been retreating for some time a few weeks before, but nobody expected this kind of crash. And what happened was everybody was completely in panic mode. We were on the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, where we were actually the primary market maker in the SPX options on that day. They actually, in those days, they changed. The primary market maker would be one firm on one day and another firm on the other day. There were actually 4 firms that were primary market makers. And so it was our responsibility to put up quotes for the S&P 500 options. And I was in that pit that morning. The Fed had actually increased the requirements for market makers and customers. They increased the margin requirements at that time, which was a big mistake because that meant that even the market makers and the professionals were panicked. We had a position in the major market index at the Board of Trade, which had 20 stocks in it. It was really a mirror of the Dow Jones average. And it was the futures market at the Board of Trade. We had a big position. I was the only member of the firm that had a full Board of Trade seat. So I actually went that morning over to the Board of Trade after, I think it was a half an hour into the market. And we realized that we needed to buy back some futures contracts. And so I went over to the Board of Trade to trade that contract.
So everybody was in panic mode, and basically everybody wanted to sell and nobody wanted to buy, but you were required to make a market, right?
Yes, you're required to make a two-sided market in the options market and the futures market too. And we had operations in New York and Chicago, both in the futures and the options and stocks. So we were trying to trade these all against each other. But at the same time, we had extreme capital requirements too. So it was a very tense time.
Yeah. So it sounded like a very risky time, and I guess from your background in blackjack, it was all about mitigating risk.
Well, it was trying to get an advantage and then stay in the game to make sure your bets are properly. You have the proper size wager at any one time. I went over to the Board of Trade, and there were just completely all sellers. That was the only, and we actually had a short position in the major market index. So I was buying in 5 lots, and suddenly at somewhere around 9:30 in the morning, there were rumors that the New York Stock Exchange would halt and the Chicago Mercantile would halt. The Chicago Mercantile was the more important market because it was the futures market. And if the Chicago Mercantile halted, it meant our markets had closed. It was a complete catastrophe. I then asked my firm to go investigate what is happened on trading halts. And of course, this is sort of ridiculous because how do we're a small firm, we had 19 people. How do I get somebody to go to the library? You had to go to the library in those days. It was before Google. And so that was sort of ridiculous. At about 10:30, I told the firm to be long on the halt because we anticipated there would be a halt of the markets. And just before that, Drexel Burnham comes in with a very large sell order. And because I'm the only buyer in the pit, he whispers to me, where will you make a market for 100 contracts? We had been trading in 5 lots. So I gave him a ridiculously low bid, and he said, you own them. I completely panicked. Of course, this was a much larger trade than I should have taken. And then the market trades slightly higher, and he says, I'll sell you another 50. I bought them. I had intended to share some of those contracts that were at a very good price with my fellow traders. I didn't do that, though, actually. And the market went straight up from that point.
Oh, really?
So that was the 87 crash. And I was just in the right place at the right time with the right.
Well, and you kept your head when other people did not.
Well, it was quite fascinating because usually when you have tremendous volume and volatility, the pits are crowded. In this case, even the local traders panicked. They went to their banks and got cash. And they took cash and went on vacation because they were scared to death. So this is the only time I've ever seen the markets. It's usually when there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of greed in the market. In this case, there was fear in the market.
Wow. And did you find that served you well moving forward, that when there was a lot of fear in the market, that was a good thing for you?
Well, this was such a unique situation, but there's no question that when there is fear and there's a lot of volatility and a lot of movement, there's more money to be made.
So I want to talk about another really large gamble you made, and that was deciding to run for public office. So this is now some years later. You had sold your company, right? At that
The
point?
crash was in '87, and I sold. Goldman Sachs came in and made an offer for our firm that was very hard to refuse. We were about to go public as a publicly traded company in 1999, and we actually were about to go on a roadshow, and so we were going to have a public offering, which would be an IPO. And Goldman looked at the numbers and they said, no, I don't think you should do that. We should pay you a premium. It would have gone public, I think, at about a $350 million market cap, but they were willing to pay 500. So it was very hard to refuse. But after that, I had a small operation, a family office, and running for office is something I hadn't done. I had been involved a little bit in the U.S. term limits move. That was to limit the terms of Congress to 6 years in the House and 3 terms and 2 terms of the Senate. And we had been successful in having ballot initiatives in a number of states. And in I think it was 92 or 93, the Supreme Court, in one of their many 5-4 decisions, decided that the states didn't have the right to control the limit on the terms of their officers. I felt that Congress would be a much better place if people went for 6 or 12 years. And I still very much believe in term limits. But so I'd been a little bit involved in politics. And then all of a sudden, somebody calls me. My congressional seat was open at that time, and I considered running for Congress. And the reason I considered running for Congress is that a gentleman by the name of Rahm Emanuel calls me, and such a complete jerk on the phone that I said
I hear he is in real life too.
he's gonna be my congressman, and I said, oh my gosh, that's and so I thought I considered running for that seat, and in the meantime, it looked like I had already given money to a female that was running, going to run for that seat too, Nancy Kazak. Then I actually did hire a consultant, and we polled it, and it sounded like Ram and I would compete with each other, and then Nancy Kazak would come right through the middle. So I then decided I'm not going to run. I'm not going to run. I go and visit Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, and we talk about it. And he says, "Well, I don't want you running for Congress." And then but he says we need somebody in the Senate. And of course, Peter Fitzgerald was the seated senator, a Republican, and very right-wing conservative against the women's right to choose and a variety of things. And so I tended to be a very moderate Democrat, but that's when I decided to run for the Senate.
So now you get into this race, and how many are there in the primary?
There's 7 candidates.
That you're running
There's 7
against?
candidates in the primary. There are 4 of us that are considered to have a chance to win, and this is a long battle because it's over. You have to visit all the counties in the state. It's difficult, and this was a reach for me. Didn't plan my life to run for the Senate, but
Right.
it's certainly an interesting experience. Must have had 12 joint appearances with the candidates, including Barack Obama, Gary Chico, and
ultimately won that race.
yeah. Well, actually,
Um,
I ended up leading. I was with 3 weeks to go. I had a reasonable lead, and unfortunately, I had a divorce settlement that became public, and that overwhelmed the race. And if you look at the polls that occurred 3 weeks before that race, you'll see that it was my race to lose.
Wow. And at some point, the Chicago papers sort of headlined the fact that you were a former professional card counter.
That certainly became a factor, but it actually ended up to be a positive factor rather than a negative factor.
That's what I was wondering, because I think to a lot of people that would be a positive. They would say, "Oh, the guy must be smart," right? I mean,
that didn't hurt. That didn't hurt.
ah, okay. So you lost to Barack Obama. If you're going to have to lose, I guess not a bad one to lose to, I guess. But now I want to go a little bit forward again. And you had retired, and my friends tease me that, I've said that I'm retired from professional gambling, and my friends say, yeah, you're retired until you get the right phone call. And and it sounds like you were retired and got the right phone call in that you read an academic paper. Should we go? Is that how it started to pull you out?
I had options was my expertise before, and then in just a few years ago, the public became excited about GameStop and also about AMC. I think it had to do something with the pandemic that they didn't know what else to do, and so they thought they could run these stocks, force the shorts to buy in, and they could make a lot of money. And so they were buying these out of the money calls in GameStop and AMC, and I thought it was at unreasonable levels, and I thought there was an opportunity. So I sold a bunch of calls in both of those stocks. And of course, the stocks did go up, and it was a little painful for a while, but it ended up to be extremely profitable. But about that time, I read an article in the Journal of Finance, which is the premier academic journal regarding equities and options. And it said, the title was Stock Options as Lotteries. It ends up that even in 2015, when this article was published, that it became apparent that people use the options markets as lottery tickets, and they buy lottery tickets on certain stocks, Tesla being my favorite. Some people love Apple, so they think it's going to go to the moon. And so it ends up, the more the option looks like a lottery ticket, the more overvalued it is. That was the main point. This is only one factor that affects the price of options, though. It ends up that high capitalization stocks, people do buy rights on those. So they tend to sell the slightly out of the money calls. And that drives the premium of all the options down. So there are options that are consistently undervalued and there are options that are consistently overvalued. And there's a whole body of academic literature that addresses this issue.
So it sounds similar in horse racing. There's a long shot bias that the public likes to bet on the long shots, which make them overvalued even more. And it sounds very similar.
I think it really is. If you, as I recall the numbers, and of course you know the experts in Bill Benter and Jenko. I think you know the guys that really know this, but I think that the average loss on a long shot is about 50%. The average loss on a favorite's about 6%, and it adds up to the average take of about 19%. So it is similar.
So yeah. So, but if you're basically selling lottery tickets, which is where the edge is being the seller of these super long shot bets, when someone hits them, your payouts are enormous. So you have this enormous amount of risk involved, right?
That's correct. And as you state in all of your gambling on an edge, you have to have the right size bet. You can't, you've got to bet optimally. You got to bet in proportion to your advantage and in proportion to your bankroll. And you got to figure out what those percentages are. I remember the team that I was on with Ken Uston, that Ken and I were the ones that calculated the loss ratios and what our bet size was. That was a big part of the strategy.
Yeah, this sounds a lot more complicated, though, when you don't really know exactly what your edge is. In blackjack, where here you don't, right?
And there are other factors that come into this. The academic literature just has their many factors that affect the price of an option. And yes, and you have certain insider actions that people may have an advantage on you. So you have to take all that into account.
Yeah. So, how long do you see yourself continuing here?
Well,
You came out of retirement because the edges were so big,
this started
but
as
you're still
this
going.
started as a small project, and I thought I could do it with 5 people. It requires all of these factors have to be put into a model that's very predictive, and we know that we've heard this thing about artificial intelligence, AI. Well, machine learning is a subject that is a subset of artificial intelligence. It's been around an awful long time. Actually, these techniques started in the 90s, and we are using those kind of techniques. Now, I did start this a little bit earlier. I started using some of these machine learning techniques in a model, in a publicly traded ETF, Hull Tactical Assembly HTUS, in 2015. And we had some simple regression models that actually didn't perform very well for a few years. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with the market as a whole, you only have a few bets. You only have one bet a year at any one time. So it's hard to get into the long run. As in blackjack, you get 100 hands an hour and you get 800 hands a day. You get 8,000. You spend 2 weeks, you get 8,000 observations, and in the market you don't get quite as many. The ETF HTUS takes advantage of some of these wagers of things that people do that affect stock returns, such as the month-end effect. People tend to have more money at the end of the month. Markets, as a result, they tend to buy stocks near the end of the month. There has been for a long time, the last day of the month and the first 3 days of the next month have been positive for the market. Similarly, the FOMC meetings have also been positive because people get scared before the meeting they actually reduce their portfolio position and then they buy it back afterwards. So there is a little bit of an effect relative to the equity. So we try to take into account all these factors, including sentiment.
Huh. And so that's HTUS is the name of the ETF. This is not something you would want to hold in a taxable account. Is that right?
Excellent. Good point. It's got to be in your IRA. It would be good for a pension fund. It would be good for a foundation that doesn't have a tax. If you have to pay taxes on this, it becomes a disadvantage. So you're exactly right. I'm glad you brought that up, Richard.
Well, I have owned some. Full disclosure, I have actually owned some of your ETF.
We're hoping that these option strategies we will be able to put those into the ETF. And I think we're actually days away from it. And that is, there's certain things that happen in the option markets. People tend to sell calls against their portfolios. So especially in indexes, sometimes they'll sell an S&P 500 call against their portfolio of stocks. And so they tend to be cheap. On the other hand, puts tend to be expensive because people need to insure their portfolio. Certain pension funds have obligations to insure their portfolio. So they have to buy. So there are some irregularities in the option market that can add to returns. We're hoping that will enhance the returns of HTU.
Well, very good. I want to thank you for doing this. This is really interesting for me, and I think it will be for our audience as well. So thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Well, there you go. Episode number 4 is in the can. Just a reminder, you can reach me at lifeisagamblepod@gmail.com or find me on Twitter at RWM21. And see you next time.